Freedom is under assault in America like never before. Who will respond to the challenge? I'm Ryan Helfenbein with the Falkirk Center for Faith and Liberty here on the campus of Liberty University. Today, I'm joined by a panel of legal scholars and commentators to talk about the challenges we face today. Former Attorney General of Kansas and Professor of Law here at Liberty University, Director of Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society, Phil Klein, welcome.
Thank you, Ryan.
Senior Pastor and Bishop of G2G Ministries in Tampa, Florida, and founder of Conservative Clergy of Color, Bishop Aubrey Shine.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Constitutional attorney and legal advisor to President Trump, Jenna Ellis. Welcome.
Thanks, Ryan.
I also have former Congressman of Virginia's 7th District, Dean of Liberty School of Business, Dave Bratt.
Thank you. Obviously, I'm the commentator.
There we go. And former Marketing Director at Tommy Hilfiger, a Michigan native and grassroots leader, Gordon Pennington. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, the situation is dire. And Phil, I want to first of all want you to explain what is the Amistad Project and what are you here to do?
Well, civil rights giant and former United States Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote this in a case called Skinner versus National Railway Executives. History teaches us that grave challenges to liberty occur at times of great urgency when constitutional rights seem too extravagant to endure. And today across the nation, we have a group of executives, of governors, who have determined that civil liberties, the foundation of this nation that has allowed us to overcome greater challenges in the past, are too extravagant to endure. And so they're manipulating fear through the exercise of what's called emergency police powers, to shut down and suspend the Bill of Rights, to render the legislature as irrelevant, and they have pronounced themselves not to be part of the lawmaking process, but to be the law. And so the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society is taking this on, and Jenna Ellis in her litigation out there in California and elsewhere is taking this on, and everybody on this panel is concerned about this effort to fundamentally redefine the identity of America. And so we're doing it in litigation. We just filed in Michigan. We've filed 7 lawsuits in Minnesota. We've got Jen out there in California just taking them on head on. And it's great to have her on the team. I'll tell you what, I don't want to be on the other side in any battle regarding that. And we're spreading across the nation and protecting those individual liberties that are so essential to the definition of who America is and is our hope.
Let's follow up and let's talk about the particulars of the case in Michigan and the Election Integrity Fund.
Okay, the Election Integrity Fund is a group of grassroots organizers, and some of them are here today outside in the audience. And what they're concerned about, Michigan has a purity in elections clause. Michiganders recognize that for every vote to count, an election must be conducted fairly. And the Michigan legislature has passed laws to ensure, for example, if you were going to vote, that nobody is lording over you saying you got to vote this way and threatening you. There's no intimidation, there's no coercion. But when we send out absentee ballots, there's nobody there to protect the voter from intimidation and coercion. So Michigan has additional laws to ensure that it's only the voter that casts the vote and not somebody else forcing them. And it's called the signature requirement. It's common sense. You know, they're for absentee ballots, but they're for absentee ballots cast by the actual voter who is registered and not somebody forcing them to cast a ballot a certain way. So you compare signatures. The Secretary of State says those laws don't apply because of COVID and has decided on her own to suspend Michigan election laws. She doesn't have the power to do that. Nobody's above the law. We're equal before the law.
Gordon, you're also leading grassroots in the area of freedom circles.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is? And you're a Michigan native, so you're a part of this. How does this affect you?
We felt the suppression of information was critical, and the oppression coming from the absence of due process under law, and the increasing feeling that we were being subject to draconian powers and the abuse of those powers in government, especially in the state of Michigan. So like many other citizens, we felt that we needed to do something that was more intelligent than sitting back and just receiving information. Now all of us this is a wonderful collection of talking parrots here today, because essentially every human being is as we think. As a man thinketh, so is he. So when you think about the idea that we are a result of our experiences, aptitudes, and education, and a variety of other conditions, we're only as good as the information we have. The reason we start a grassroots movement is to create more discussion, more debate, more dialogue. We're only going to be as good as the information we have. Now, you got a wonderful group of people here. I feel very privileged and honored to be amongst them. But the point is, like every other citizen, most people want to know the truth. What are the facts around their circumstances? Absent that, we're in very, very deep trouble. And we are in a very unusual time, too, because of the nature of surveillance capitalism. We are all subject to devices. In fact, most of us put our devices down if we don't have them on us now, that essentially inform and direct and advise and give us all kinds of information, both good and bad. But because of the nature of the data world we live in, with AI and big data and all the things that essentially create algorithms of behavioral conditioning that allow us to essentially stay in echo chambers, we're very dangerously apt to be subject to things that we're not even fully conscious of. So I'm here simply as an advocate. I've worked in media and marketing and communications and messaging. I'm here to suggest that we have got to get better information. We've got to go back to civil discourse, debate, and discussion for us to have any sense. None of us know everything. It's a very educated and capable people here, but none of us know everything. So we've got to hear each other. Even the people we don't like or agree with, we must hear from one another to be a robust society.
Absolutely. Jenna, I want to bring you into this discussion. So you're a part of another Thomas More suit in California. Tell us about Pastor John MacArthur and what's happening there, and then what is the greater threat to constitutional liberty at large?
Yeah, so I'll address the second question first, because I think it sets the stage, and for what Phil was also saying, when we talk about our rights and why it's so imperative to protect them in society, we have to understand the unique exceptionalism of America and what our Constitution was actually designed to protect. And so when you look at the course of human history and you look at the course of government, leaders and those in power generally came into power one of two ways, either by heritage or by conquest. And here in America, our founders saw that span of human history. They saw the abuses of government, and they recognized for the first time in world history that the truth of the matter is that our rights come from God, our Creator, and all of us, only by virtue of being human beings made in the image of God, have all of our rights. And the government's sole purpose is to preserve and protect those rights. And they articulated that so precisely set down in the Declaration of Independence when they said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They went on to say then that the sole purpose of government is to preserve and protect those rights. So they established the best form of government in order to do that. And we have a constitution that's designed to protect those rights. And it's no coincidence, Ryan, that the First Amendment protects our first freedoms, which are the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, and the free exercise of religion, to do the things that we're talking about when you talk about the importance of dialogue, to come together to speak together about the things of truth and about God. Those are the foundational elements of why our rights are essential. And so what's going on in California is that those rights are being foreclosed because they're too extravagant. And so what the LA County is saying is that in order to have this health crisis and for this public health crisis, we now have to say that our right to speak together about truth and about God and practice our sincerely held religious beliefs are foreclosed under the auspices of this public health mandate. But what they're doing is unilaterally foreclosing our rights by saying that this public health crisis is more important than your decision to freely practice your religion. So they are trying to shut down Pastor John MacArthur's church and every other church in California. And we are challenging that by saying, no, it's our fundamental God-given right. And we can decide for ourselves as adults whether or not we want to stay home and live stream or whether we want to come together and speak the truth about God. So we're challenging that, not only the law itself, the public health order, that's actually not a law, it's just a further iteration, and it's an abuse of power. It's an executive overreach of the legislature's Emergency Powers Act. We're challenging that, and we're saying, no, our rights are sacred, and our Constitution requires that we give heightened protection to churches. We give heightened protection to individuals. These public health officials can't just come in and dictate for us when, where, and how we can practice our faith.
And Bishop Shine, I want to bring you into this discussion as well. You pastor a church actively there in Tampa, Florida. How important is the First Amendment to you, the freedoms you enjoy as a pastor? And then also, what greater implications does it have to the entire American project?
Well, overall, the landscape that we really exact that premise from is really based on that amendment. Because if you strip that away from guys and girls like myself that have and should have free expression, we're in trouble. And this is why our group addresses issues like that. We are an alternative voice because we're not hearing our voice in the mainstream media at all. Take, for instance, Booker T. Washington made an interesting comment once. He said that when individuals find themselves at the behest of government, then there is never a need for those individuals to ever get healed. He said there's a reason that these same individuals find themselves lording over and then as well becoming the prescriber of something, because the patient never gets well. Therefore, they now keep a job and they have preeminence. Well, our group says there's something fundamentally wrong with that narrative. And we see this being lived out in Black Lives Matter, where you have organizations that, large organizations, that are giving millions of dollars to a Marxist regime that hates this nation and fights against everything like my paternal grandfather died for in a war to preserve. And so as leaders, as shepherds, we're speaking out against this narrative. We're working with other groups as well to say, if we don't unite as a nation, we're going to lose. And it's something that I did very, very recently in an op-ed where I said, America has been divided before, but we've never lost. But if we don't fight for the very DNA of this nation, black and white and brown together, Ryan, we're going to lose it. And we can't afford to do that.
I want to talk a little bit and just shift for a second about the toxicity of identity politics and how that's entered in. And so you mentioned BLM Inc., there's many others, Antifa, but they're really trying to push this intersectionality and rather being about individual liberty, group people into collectives. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, we have a lot of comments against that because, again, this takes away the idea of God. What BLM and others are really doing is they're the pseudo-God now of the nation. If you don't have this herd mentality, then you're going to, quote, not be part of the mainstream. Therefore, you're ostracized. You're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to live out your faith in these other areas of life, work, play, etc. And as a shepherd who have counseled professional ballers that are out there, whether they're in the NFL or the Major League Baseball, I can tell you that they're stagnant in their voices. They're being forced into that doctrine to simply say, if you don't agree with the bigger cause, you're fired. Your endorsements are taken away from you. Now, these same groups and some of the athletes that I have had to interact with, as well as some entertainers as well, they can't talk about things, for instance, like traditional marriage. They can't talk about their belief as it relates to God. If they don't coexist within this parameter that their particular organization is forcing them into, then they lose endorsements, they lose playing time, therefore their families can't be taken care of. And so our group says, that's not America. That's something akin to socialism. We don't like it. We fought some wars over this concept. By the way, we won that war. And we're going to continue to fight because if you find individuals that don't have that expression, what you're going to find is a spirit of anarchism. And it just doesn't work in America. Ryan, we can do better than that.
If I could, Ryan, just to build on that and something that Jenna said, and I'm interested, Dave, in your work with students as Dean of the Business School, whether you're seeing this. We're living in a time in America where speech is considered violence, and violence is called speech. And the first assault of tyranny is on free speech. And any movement at its extremes becomes what it decries. And so what we're seeing, and we've been gifted, as Jen has so articulated, a divine truth at our nation's founding, that each one of us has intrinsic value. Yes. Our value's not defined by the group we're a member of. It is our intrinsic value, and a higher moral authority than government gave that value, so government's constrained from reducing that value. And it's in that declaration. It is a wonderful expression, but it was gifted to a flawed people, as our faith teaches us. And we misused it at times for slavery, for oppression, for denying women. But the truth has helped us overcome. Now, I'm wondering, Dave, in the students you're dealing with, do you see them buying into this toxic national dialogue that different people have different values? It's happened in the past. Nazi Germany, Jews by a group are to be damned. America, the eugenics movement, you're to be sterilized. Are we seeing a resurrection of that in the halls of our institutions of higher learning?
Yeah, at Liberty, we're blessed. But even at Liberty, like Jenna went into the basics of the founding, our students are steeped in that and in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But the founders made one mistake. They produced the architecture for a system that assumed the Judeo-Christian tradition would be here forever. They just assumed it. They made us the sovereign. They made the people the sovereign. So, we believe God is the only sovereign. So in tactical terms, at the time, hey, it worked, and it's been just a blessing for our country. But now we come to this new Marxist reality. And so the kids have been trained into diversity and pluralism and toleration, all of which are great and made our system work under the old assumptions that the Judeo-Christian tradition and moral strand was there. Well, now that's not there, so the students are confused. And the Marxists are taking real estate, right? So, my call to everybody out there is take action, right? This is about action, action, action today. It's not about the left has contradicted themselves and write a white paper, right? Go to got-freedom.org, got-freedom.org, and play a role. And if you're not playing a role and doing something, like making a list, organizing with your churches, getting student groups together, work with Charlie Kirk, whoever, if you're not doing something, it ain't gonna work, right? The Marxists have declared themselves, Marxists, the radical groups out there, they're taking real estate right now. It's not time to sit at your little blog and say, oh, they contradicted themselves. We all know they're Marxists, right? They don't believe in God. And so we're fighting back.
So action.
Action right now. Our students, right, don't know what Marxism is. The Marxists are very clever, the neo-Marxists, right, the identity politics and all this, they cloak it. And so how in the world are the Marxists running things when they don't even educate it? They fight with stealth, right? But the way, I got a surefire method, it's Marxism for dummies in 5 seconds. You can tell a Marxist, when the left wants to tear things down, that's what they do. They deconstruct, right? We've constructed the Judeo-Christian tradition, the rule of law, the Constitution, pro-business, free markets, the wealthiest country. We've constructed all that. The Marxists want to tear it all down, and you can tell a Marxist because you just ask them, who are you going to put up as the statue? What system replaces free markets? What replaces the Constitution? Crickets. If you hear crickets, you know you're dealing with a Marxist. And we got to get that through our students' minds.
And I want to highlight one other thing, though, that Dave said and shift it just a little bit, because that is taught that under our system and our structure of the Constitution, that we the people are the sovereign. But I would challenge that idea a little bit to say that actually what our founders recognized because of our intrinsic value, and they said this so eloquently at the end of the Declaration when they called God our Creator the supreme judge of the universe. Mm-hmm. They understood whose courtroom they were in. Right, they understood the highest authority. Right. So even though we are the sovereign in the sense that we are the executors of that law, we don't actually have any legitimate authority under our system of government to do anything separate and apart from God our Creator and as set forth in the Judeo-Christian worldview. And that has to be our argument, because law school teaches that law is arbitrary, and whatever our legislature sets, then if we wanted to get together and say that abortion is okay, then not only through judicial activism and all those problems, if our legislature said that, then that would be okay under our system of government. That's
Except
false.
this law school.
That's false. Except
want
this
to
law
say
school.
this
That's
law
true.
school's
And yes, but law school generally, and that's fair. That's a fair point. And so, but that's completely false. And so we don't have supreme legislative authority, just like in what I tell my students is, we understand that there are specific limits on the legislature. If Congress got together and said, we want to repeal the law of gravity tomorrow, that's a great idea. Well, we all know, and we laugh, right? Because we know we don't have that authority. We don't have the authority under our constitutional structure to go against the supreme sovereign that our founders recognized at the very beginning.
We discover law.
Yes.
We don't make law.
C.S. Lewis said that so
there you go.
eloquently. Yes.
So let's reframe this a little bit, because I know there's a fighting spirit and we need to be committed to action, okay? And so we have action. What else can we do? What else can be done?
Well,
That's the
I
question.
thank Dave for mentioning
Absolutely.
god-freedom.org. Go
That's
there.
right.
It's got steps to engage. But I think even broader. You know, in public office, and I don't know if you've all experienced this, you probably in your pastorate have experienced this, oftentimes people would rather us agree about a lie than disagree on the truth, because they don't want to spend the suffering time to think. Thinking is suffering. Suffering in the ancient Hebrew means to lift to a higher purpose.
I think Solomon said that too, but yeah, that's right.
And so what's real important is to think through this. And let me give you just one example. Yeah. Recently, the governor of Michigan sent out a news release saying she's responsible for saving thousands of lives of Michiganders. And people aren't thinking below that comment of the presumptuous nature of that statement. What she's really saying is, my fellow neighbors, constituents, and residents of Michigan are not concerned enough about a deadly virus to abide in their freedom responsibly and respect others, that if she had asked them to distance 6 feet, they would refuse. So it was necessary for her to threaten them with jail. In other words, we're presuming now America is a group of people who will not exercise their freedom with responsibility. So we need this patriarch. We need this matriarchal system where we have a king and a queen that's residing over us. That is an awfully presumptuous statement. She also is presuming the legislature can't function. They're not wise enough. What she is saying is, I'm the repository of wisdom. You go back to your circuses and bread, and I will take care of you. That's not America. And I would just add this, that liberty not protected in process, in time, is liberty lost. And that's what's happening in America today.
Yeah, there's a reason we exercise.
Yeah.
We don't just have our freedoms that we can think and believe in the security of whatever the government wants to define as responsible. She's also presuming she gets to define responsibility. There's a reason we have to exercise our sincerely held beliefs.
And we're concerned, even especially with clergy. I'm reminded of something Dr. King said. When a church ceases to engage its culture and change it, it actually is no more than a group of guys, girls that come together for entertainment. And if we're not going to really engage ourselves and really begin to address the issues that are out there, then we are failing, not just God, we're failing God's people. And this is why, if we continue to collaborate the way that we're doing now, it's not just talking, by the way. These are guys and girls that are out here fighting. Some are losing their jobs, by the way. But if we don't engage in that process, we're going to continue to have the mainstream media tell us, as is the governor of Michigan, that having the status in a particular system, think for the people, is the best thing. Well, we've already seen the failure in that. And this is why, again, our group, we address issues of this magnitude. We're saying, look, if we're going to look for silly things like reparations, why not go to the party that gave you the problem in the first place? If we're going to address these issues of what they call systemic racism in America, which is a lie, by the way, at least we'd be able to address it from the standpoint, there is a particular group that gave you these problems. Have that dialogue.
That's called justice.
I know, I thought it was justice. And so we're engaging like that And this is why we're going to make a difference. And this is why we're standing together to say, you know what, if we don't roll up our sleeves and really engage in this, we're going to lose this nation. I would rather die fighting than to lose this nation.
Amen. Real quick, the American Revolution began in pulpits.
Absolutely.
The Civil Rights Movement began in pulpits. So if the pulpit is just rendered ineffective, if they're silenced, churches can't gather, they can't meet, what will that mean for the future of freedom?
It would shut down the concept of God. I mean, not that God would be shut out of he's going to win, period. That, I read the book. This battle is a done deal. However, he still delegates responsibility to the men and women that he gave that to. He didn't just give something and then advocate position and say, I want nothing else to do with it. He's engaging. So when leaders fail to exercise this thing called this great Constitution, then we're going to, and we can all just get your passport, take a trip. You don't have to really go that far. And those of us that have traveled the globe, we can tell you there's nothing better than America. It doesn't exist. That's why everyone is trying to get here. And this is why the work that Phil and others are doing with this whole issue of voting, I'm afraid. I'm afraid because if you strip my vote away, what you are assuming is if I don't look on the outside a certain kind of way, you're assuming that I'm going to vote a certain kind of way. I don't want to give anyone that power. I want to be able to express what I believe, where I believe it, as often as I believe it. Take that away from the pulpit, and you will have what we have seen throughout the course of history, and that is a spirit of anarchism. And we all know how that ends up. Not pretty good.
Ryan, it causes me to think of something, and I'm curious because everyone on this panel has been out there speaking. And when I first ran for office 34 years ago, I remember there were stark differences in opinions, but there was a freedom in the air of dialogue and speech. And what I experienced in Michigan, just announcing this litigation yesterday, was fear. It hovered over many people who were afraid to speak out, who were concerned that the regulatory agency of the state would shut down their business if they spoke out against getting 159 new regulations from the health department on Thursday that they had to implement on Friday. People are fearful of speaking. And that is the first step towards tyranny, when the greatness and genius of America, which isn't in the halls of power, it's around our kitchen room tables, it's in families, it's in communities, starts to become silent. And I'm curious if you sense that, if you've experienced that in your own work, and do you sense the dread on speech that is harboring itself or residing in America?
It's a suffocation of the human spirit, and as you rightly described it, I think people, as Aubrey said, if you haven't traveled and had the opportunity to see other systems, other countries, other nation states, how they operate, it's not, as someone said earlier, that we're perfect, but the American system under the Constitution has an ability to recognize its faults, to repair itself, to heal itself, to address itself, to grow, to change. This is a group that's well-traveled, and I've had the privilege or opportunity at least to travel multiple times in Russia, China, Cuba. I've been with freedom fighters, the underground church. I've even met with the oligarchs that run these systems. You cannot imagine the mindset they have, which is based on a lack of truth, a lack of information. When you take freedom out of the room, that you remove the oxygen of human life, you remove the ability to debate, to feel, to resolve things because you've got more information. I don't suspect that most of us even doubt the intent of many of those who are opposed to what we're doing.
Good intentions or not, they're kings and queens, whether they,
And I think many people want to do the right thing, they just haven't got the information they need to make better decisions. When have you heard medical science so maligned by the supercilious abuse of the word science? Science is about the empirical method. We have to look at all the data so we can debate it and come up with better solutions. This is a disgrace to science and to intelligence. So we've got to have more dialogue, and I'm here to advocate the idea that civil discourse is essential to our survival.
Yeah, well, I'll just tack on a little bit, just the folks at home, if they're listening, the civil discourse, right? JFK is an example of a good liberal, right? Catholic, pro-American, pro-business, pro-everything, right? That liberal is now gone. Now we're dealing with this new left, You just got to go back to my district, Richmond, Virginia, go to Monument Avenue. If you don't have a particular sign in your window, your house is going up in flames. You want to talk about fear. I mean, that's fear. And then all the business folks in Richmond that I still stay somewhat in touch with, and these are titans. These are some big folks, and they don't dare speak out, or you'll get canceled. Your firm will go under. You will personally be put into bankruptcy. Your kids will be tortured publicly. And the press is the modern guillotine, right? They can kill you these days. They can take your life away from you with the press. And so we got a major fight on our hands. And it's everywhere.
And I want to link a couple of these ideas real quick. And so when you're talking about the importance of public discourse and the imperfection of our Constitution, that's so true that our founders recognized that man is imperfect, but we serve a perfect God. And we serve a perfect sovereign who gave us these rights and our ability to then understand in the reality to which he presented us that there are three different spheres of government: the civil, the family, and the church. And what you're saying about how the pastors are silent in the pulpits, this fear started long before this with the regulatory state, with the IRS and the tax exemptions, right? That fear of losing your tax exempt status silenced pastors. When did pastors decide that tax exemptions are more important than speaking the truth? And the truth is the best way of civic engagement and making sure that we perfect our system. 27 times in our nation's history, we have amended our Constitution. I'm grateful for the 19th Amendment. I can vote among this panel of men, right? So I'm so glad that we are progressing toward creating a more perfect union. And the way we do that is education and with civic participation. The best way we can do that is to vote, and pastors have to be speaking about that from the pulpit. And that's exactly what this fear is designed to try to foreclose, is our civic participation, because we are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We, the people, get to select and prefer, and as our first Chief Justice John Jay said, we need to select and prefer Christians as our leaders. Why? Because Christians understand the brilliance of this constitutional design.
And by the way, before he said that, actually Moses actually came out with that concept. He said, why not choose and select, it was Moses' father-in-law Jethro, he says, select and choose individuals that are going to represent your God. So before him, there was Moses. I just had to.
Absolutely, yes. Go to the Supreme Court, all of the divine, all of the law.
Can I brag a little bit and just steal one thing and say, you were one of our students.
Yes, I was. Thank you. Yes, Professor.
It all comes full circle. It all comes full.
And that's why education is so important, because without that, I wouldn't have received all of the great heritage.
And that's the turning point, because we lost education as an institution that we could safeguard for free speech, for free debate, for academic honesty. And so many, we're seeing this more and more, tenured professors who can't even speak to the truth and understanding in their areas of expertise.
It's fascinating. I've heard this word several times in a culture that proclaims it doesn't exist, and that is truth. And it's real interesting, because when you dissect what we're saying, we are building on our commonality rather than building on our differences. We are building on the recognition that each one of us is so valuable to a creative and a loving God that he seeks us out individually. And it's not a part of a group, it's his relationship directly with us. I've always pondered this. We have a lot of discussion about diversity. But diversity is a wonderful manifestation of a creative and loving God, but it's not our greatest strength. Our greatest strengths are those truths that bring people of a diverse background to a common understanding. And we're diverse here. We all have different backgrounds. We are agreeing on a truth, but we all have different backgrounds and different histories. And that's where we built this nation, on that foundation. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a hopeful thing. And I still think it speaks to the heart of America.
It's the unanimous declaration. Can you imagine Congress right now having a unanimous declaration on anything?
Since the pastor invoked Moses and education and truth, I think it is interesting. The younger evangelical group coming up.
Yes.
They're being educated. But it is amazing. There's 39 books in the Hebrew Scripture, and the central event in Hebrew Scripture is the Exodus. It is a political event. Right. So loving, compassionate God who, out of love, says, Moses, go there and let my people go, right, to fight. Right. And if we lose track of those 39 books, as in our education process, we're missing something. So we all got some work to do.
There's a false humility that is masquerades as weakness. Humility is courage.
Yes.
So, by the way, this is great, and there's several areas here because we talk about education.
Can we do this another day?
Yeah, we need to. Well, we talk about education, but there's also a conditioning that takes place. There's almost like there's two Americas because there's two different educational institutions, if you will. The institution of the family and the institution of the state. The family could be homeschooling, private education, whatever, or it could be charter schools. But then you also see just abdicating to the state, the education of your children.
Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind regarding that, I believe. And when I served in the legislature, I saw these trends. A generation ago, and I'm not saying, it's wonderful the opportunities women have in the workplace, but a generation ago, you could raise a family on a single income. It's almost impossible now. And because of the demands to provide for a family, and also opportunity. And again, I'm not against that. I was raised by a single mother who raised 5 of us on her own by starting a business. And her primary obstacle was government. Right. Government overreach, government regulation, but what's happened is as women entered the workplace, all of the benefits economically haven't come to the family because there's additional cost. There's transportation costs, there's clothing costs, there's childcare costs, there's additional costs to the family. But government sucked up that income. And so now government has put us in a position where the family is so overworked just to provide basic things that we have to abdicate much of parenting to schools. And we've trusted schools, but we no longer can trust education. And that's a concern, and it burdens all of us.
The inflationary, someone might argue, an economist might argue, that's thank you, John Maynard Keynes, because it's the inflationary effects of the post-war Marshall Plan and everything else. But you basically had government multiplying.
Government profited on all of that.
So what the average mortgage was five years in the 1930s. Now it's a 30-year mortgage.
Say that again.
Yeah, it was 5 years. The average mortgage
that's
5
the
years
difference.
long. Yeah, so if you put a 30-year mortgage, right, and that also people say lifts the economy, but that's part of the problem is that we've outspent ourselves.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's huge.
And it's a great burden.
But let's go back to, we're talking about culture of fear. We're talking about a new cultural hegemony in this country. We're talking about people being socially conditioned not to speak out because they're afraid of being canceled. And I think that's really, really important in this discussion. We need fighters more than ever. People are willing to, the reason President Donald Trump won the election in 2016 was because he was a fighter. Yeah. Okay? We would not be here if it wasn't for President Trump. And you look at all the other 16 that were nominees, they wouldn't have gone this far or fought this hard against the media. Media is out there to destroy everyone, including us. We need fighters.
Absolutely.
How do we fight?
Well, I think you have to search yourself to find what you're willing to suffer for. And again, suffering in the Hebrew means to live to a higher purpose. Yeah. And so every parent suffers for their child. Every child in education suffers to grow their mind. Where is your passion? Which also means, by the way, in the Latin, to suffer. So where is your passion in life, your purpose in life? Because that's where Christ said, take my yoke, it is easy, the burden is light. It becomes ease, not dis-ease. When we live in falsehood, it's dis-ease. But when we give ourselves to those things that matter in our heart, there's a great ease to it. So Americans need to suffer for freedom. And they need to pour themselves into it.
They do. But even for leaders, and I beg every leader that's really paying attention to this to understand this here. The moment you take a position, you are going to pay a price for it, period. When I did the work that I did just a few years ago, there was a lady that was running for president. Some of you may know her. Her name is Hillary Clinton. She wrote in her book, one of the reasons she's lost, and she put my name in her book. She says, because of Bishop Aubrey Shine's types, the type of work we were doing, just exposing, it wasn't a right or left issue for me, it was an American issue for me. Now, when she put that out there, that I was one of the reasons that she lost, I suffered. I suffered because there were engagements that had been cut off from me. I even had banking institutions, and I didn't know this was legal until we contacted our lawyers, that they said, we no longer want your business. Now, they didn't tell us why. We never had any negative marks, ever. But we were kicked out of institutions simply because we chose to fight.
That's
You
the
were
America
canceled.
we're creating.
That's
the
what we're
canceling.
dealing with
Yeah.
right here. So for every pastor, every leader, understand something. When you stand for truth, I don't care what that truth looks like and what is shrouded under. You better understand, you may have to pay your life for it. But if you're not willing to do it, you may want to try a different vocation. This is not for the
Yeah,
weak
you're not
of
a
heart.
leader.
No,
you're not a leader
leader.
otherwise.
There's a false pietism among the left. It's another kind of, it's an alternative righteousness where people virtue signal. This is the perennial doctrine. You, the church, or anybody else who holds to an alternative righteousness, you are apostate.
You're right. It's a
Yes,
hegemony.
yes,
It's
yeah.
creating one version of humankind.
That's right. That's right.
It's frightening.
Jenna, how important is that? moving forward?
It's so incredibly critical. And I look at people like President Trump, and then I look at people like John MacArthur, who are taking a stand. And what's so interesting and fascinating, I mean, you'd never think that in 2020 you would compare the two as having, having things in common. But the one commonality, and I've gotten to know both of these men personally very well, and the thing that they have in common, they don't fear men. They don't fear men's opinion. And when you look at fear of man in the Bible, you contrast that with the fear of God. Both of these men are leaders and they are world changers because they simply stand for truth because they have the fear of God. And that's the example that all of us need to harness and say, who do we fear? Because when we fear man, when we fear the consequences over our Creator, that's when we get into all of these situational ethics, we get into this cancel culture. We fear what some man might do to us rather than fearing God, our Creator. And the best way we can do that is to simply stand firm. Look at all of the examples throughout Scripture of Daniel, who simply prayed. He didn't matter what the edict was from the king. He simply did what he was called to do like every other day before. When 1 Peter talks about always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that lies within you, be prepared to speak up, and God will call all of us to different things and different design and purpose, but the one thing we all have in common is that we should fear God. We are Americans and we should be exercising our vote, and we as Christians need to be responsible citizens to participate in this great design of America and this great heritage that President Trump from Mount Rushmore, that was one of his, I think, the best speeches ever from an American president. When he comes out and he says, my fellow citizens, like every other president since George Washington, that means something. That means I am one of you, I am vested with the limited legitimate powers of government to preserve and protect your rights. We need to participate in the vote, and we need to participate in fearing God over man.
There's a dangerous self-interest in leaders today to wrestle the ghosts of what are the repercussions of their speech. Yeah. And all you have to do is clear the air and decide what's right and stand your ground. It's much easier than what they think.
Like what John MacArthur is saying. He is saying we're not here to be rebellious. We are here simply to stand firm.
Yeah, and all this stuff is at the lofty heights, and some of the fight isn't lofty. The guy that founded this university, Jerry Falwell, in the 80s just said, I'm sick of it, let's get the band together. Yeah. Evangelicals, Protestants, Mormons, Jewish friends, boom, let's get together, stand for common morality, and boom, by the end of the 80s, you got Reagan and a revolution. In my own election, the Tea Party was active, the people got energy, and it's gone now. It's still not back to that pitch.
Well, and it's illegal now. Much of your grassroots politics, they wouldn't allow now.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the day's not gone. We just, everybody at home, you get the energy back, get the band back together again, and go to got-freedom.org. These other people don't seem to be able to see what I see down there.
God-freedom.org.
That's right. So we've got to create a co-belligerency. You mentioned Dr. Falwell, the moral majority. What he accomplished in the 80s was bringing disparate groups together. They didn't all agree theologically.
Right.
And some of them, were even outside the faith, many of them. And they all came together. That's the problem that we see today, is that among conservatives, there's usually a spirit of competition that's natural. That's part of why we're pro-capitalism. There's a spirit of competition. But what we have to recognize in understanding the times is we have to come together.
Well, and there's such strength in this truth that you see voices on the left who are now standing up and saying this assault on free speech is a problem. They're signing letters. They're starting to see it. There is a commonality that transcends politics, that transcends those identities about individual liberty that still resonates in America. And so one of the things I'd like to encourage are the voices on the left, those who have stood. I worked alongside them. I much rather would work alongside someone on the left of principle, because then we had a language we could debate, rather than somebody in the mushy middle who's putting their finger in the air and trying to determine where the flow is, and no principle guides them except maintaining office. That type of leadership is a failure in leadership.
Absolutely. And one other thing too, when we're talking about Christian truth, we have to be careful to define our terms very clearly. Because as all the lawyers on this panel know, when you go in and you have definitions, that wins the argument often. And so we have to make sure that we are not defining truth as anything other than truth itself. And we have to be very careful to educate and to make sure that we are speaking boldly the things of truth, and we're not allowing all of these different definitions, my truth versus your truth. That is an insidious idea in our current culture, and especially with the students. They're going, well, I wouldn't do it, but I can't, give my morality to you. That's not true. Morals exist separate and apart from ourselves, and God, our sovereign.
And thank God there were those who had the courage to stand for the truth that African Americans were individuals with value at a time when this nation proclaimed them to be property. It's not my truth and your truth. You can have a slave, I won't. There is a truth. That's right. And we will stand.
Yeah. And by the way, just going back to how the left argues, is everything is appropriated by identity, by political, social, ethnic identity. So for example, in the 1930s, unless you're a Jew, you can't speak out against the Holocaust, right? That's the way the left argues. Unless you're black, or unless you're white, unless you're female, or whatever, homosexual, you can't speak to a certain issue. You've been silenced. That's the problem, is that if truth transcends and supersedes all of that, so I can say that is bad, that is evil, that is wicked. I don't have to be a mother to recognize that abortion is evil. I can say that as a man.
Yeah, they've changed things. Yes. This nation was founded on the truth that all persons are created equal with intrinsic value by a loving God. What the left is saying now is that it's not people that are created equal in destroying truth, it's ideas. So you can't differ with my idea. And it's all about power if there is no truth. We couldn't even have this conversation if there is no truth. They are deconstructing. And as they deconstruct, it becomes about who has the largest gun.
That's it.
And we've seen it. About 8 miles from where we sit right now is a colony that used to be called the Colony for the Feeble-Minded in Virginia.
Yeah, talk about that. That's an important history.
And this is the Supreme Court case the left is standing on, and it's Buck v. Bell. And what happened is Virginia at this time decided certain groups of people were a drain on society. In other words, they defined the value based on what you could contribute or what they thought was valuable rather than an intrinsic value. And they said, blacks, no, you don't have value in this society. And you certainly can't marry a white woman, or a black woman can't marry a white man. We can't mix the blood, so to speak. They decided that certain people who are unemployed should be sterilized against their will because they were a drain on society. And it was right up here, Carrie Buck, who had been raped by her landlord's son, was put in an institution to cover up the rape, was declared feeble-minded, that the state, the left, and identity politics decided to sterilize as a test case to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1927, the United States Supreme Court said this: you are right. You are a drain on society, Carrie Buck. We're going to prevent you from having children for the remainder of your life. And the Supreme Court voted that up 8-1. That's their legal precedent today. That's the law that they're standing on to say we have the right to do this. It is a dark stain in American history because it was utilitarianism becoming government. And I'll tell you what, in utilitarianism, the individual always loses because 2 is more than 1. It's a brutal math, and we need to reject it.
But it unfortunately sounds like you're talking about eugenicists. The same thing that
That's
happened
exactly what I'm talking
with
about.
a group of individuals called Margaret Sanger
Yes.
who is founder of Planned Parenthood, that looked at blacks and said, "You're weeds, you need to be exterminated." And by the way, she went on to say, "And the way we're going to get rid of you, we're going to elect men of a particular party," and I can't help this as fact. The Democrat says the same thing, so they're still identifying. So when I hear the black and white issue,
Yeah, it
and
was
by
the
the
group
way,
politics
those
of
of
that
us
day.
who have an ethos of God made all races with one blood, I guess I wouldn't qualify because I have a black dad and a Jewish mom. So I guess I'm on the wrong side of both issues here. So when I hear this argument and I understand the history of that argument, this is why groups like ours, we're fighting. We're saying, hey, America, these are the groups that are trying to continue to define you by your skin color or by your gender or whatever identity that they want to group you all into. And we're saying that's a false narrative. It's an anti-God narrative. God doesn't view the same way, and we're going to have to fight a different fight. And this is why we're shut down, shut out of the mainstream media, because voices of reason and logic and history, it doesn't fit their narrative. Right. This is why GotDash, freedom.org is a great organization to be a part of.
Absolutely.
We haven't brought up the topic of propaganda. Where do these narratives come from? How loud is the narrative? It may shock some, but many people don't even know the history of Planned Parenthood. They don't even know who Margaret Sanger is. Yeah. So this is something that's stock in trade for those of us who realize these ideas are nuanced, they're complex. But the left wants to create this a false idea that things are much easier simplified, and the louder the better. No, life is much more complex. Human beings are complex, and we understand that. Truth survives in an era where we understand that it requires a vibrant understanding of how it is discussed. And if we don't understand that we're in an era of propaganda, a wall of sound, rather than something that leads to discourse and ideas, we're going to go back to this over and over. That's why we're here together, to have these discussions and get these ideas out to whosoever will listen.
And the last thing on that too, that this is why when you're talking about the valuation of an individual, right, and you're talking about what they can contribute to society and all of these different just ridiculous anti-God ideas, that's why it's so important in America that we don't turn our fundamental God-given pre-political unalienable rights into mere privileges. Because when we have a government that says we can determine for you, this is when, where, and how, you can speak, then we're saying we have a First Amendment right, and that the government, when they get together with the 9 robed justices, then they can determine arbitrarily how you can exercise that privilege. I don't have a First Amendment right of freedom of speech. I have a God-given pre-political fundamental unalienable right to freedom of speech that my government, through the First Amendment, preserves and protects. Without that, if they abolish the First Amendment tomorrow, I'd still have all my rights. We cannot allow our rights to be turned into mere privileges.
So before there was the First Amendment, there was Acts 4 and 5.
Yeah.
And that's what Christians
Sounds
seem to
familiar.
understand. Yeah, that's what Christians...
And
so,
Moses.
By the way, there's a great decoupling of young Christians from the actual Bible, and that's part of the problem. Let's round this up and bring it home. What are we hoping for? What are we praying for? What are we looking forward to as we press this case forward, and hopefully others?
Well, first of all, I think we're hoping and praying for an awakening, because it's going to take more voices than just this. But secondly, I would hope and pray for a United States Supreme Court that is rooted in an understanding of what we're speaking, that truth, that individual value, individual liberty is significant and not too extravagant to endure. And there's not a pandemic exception to the Constitution of the United States. That these rights, this speech, this dialogue, the right to disagree is fundamental to a healthy democratic republic. And that we are a nation that expressly rejected at its founding group identity politics, that our rights are determined by government. Just as Jenna was saying, this is not a privilege. This is an intrinsic, inherent right. Now, what we're facing legally, and we were discussing this a little bit ahead of this, is unprecedented. So our modern jurisprudence, the way the court has structured the debate, doesn't fit the time, but the threat and the truth does. And they need to limit these police powers. No governor should be able to say, I am the law, and how I wake up in the morning determines what you can do. It reminds me when I was a child, and my mom would say, you can't do this, Phil. And I'd say, but why? Well, in this house, I'm the law. Well, that's okay for a family. You know, you have that structure. It's not okay for a governance of a free and rational people. No governor is the law. No governor is above the law. That was our revolution, by the way. That was our revolution, as was the Civil War, saying even the Constitution, when it is flawed, is not the law. When it speaks a lie, it's not the law. The law is God's truth, that we all have value. And that's what we need Americans to recognize is the core of our liberty and our freedom. And it's in danger. It is under threat, like nothing I've seen in my lifetime. And we need their voices. So I do believe it's real interesting. I find myself praying for a strong court against weak governors who are tempted and grab power and believe, even good intentions or not, that they are the repository of all wisdom, and all those citizens out there can't understand it as well as they can.
Yeah.
If I can add one more thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this concerns me as well, and I'd be curious what others say, and I could do this for another couple of hours. I'm sorry. I'm ruining your end.
No,
okay.
You're not. Go.
Science is not the determinant of freedom.
Yeah.
Science informs us. Science determines what is. What ought to be is a moral equation. And that's what we're talking about today, what ought to be. Science should inform, but it shouldn't dictate. Yeah. If science dictated the breadth of freedom, I would have never left a padded room, and I'd still be drinking this green sludge my daughter comes up with that she says is healthy. If science is the measurement of freedom and safety is the sole aim of government, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. We have to inform ourselves about this and then protect freedom. When have we lost faith in democracy? When did we lose that faith?
Yeah.
We lost it when we started fearing man over God.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I think if we're going to really put this in perspective, you cannot have a prescription without a prescriber. You can't have moral laws without a moral lawgiver. It's impossible. Our rights come from God. Now, one may choose not to believe that, and in this great country, that's okay with us. But to inhibit us, whether it's by way of voting, shutting us down within the framework of employment, whatever those things are that squashes our voice, squashes the idea of God. So what we're saying in a nutshell is, here are the alternatives. You can choose to obey the state and die, and or you can have this idea of God and live. Well, this is what we're doing. We're simply saying, let's come together, let's get the band back together, and let's make sure that in this symphony that we're all trying to reach the same tone, and that is, it's God, it's country, it's individualism. That's America, that's what we're trying to do.
I think the thing that I admire most about panels like this and people who are proposing to have discussions like this is the essential nature of being open-minded. We're fighting essentially against the closing of the American mind. We've been warned about this for years. We didn't get here overnight. We've been on a slow and steady path of attrition, giving up too much ground to the idea that there is a truth, that there are ideas that are worth discussing in debate, in dialogue, in discourse. And I believe that every panelist here supports the idea that we want to be in dialogue with our fellow Americans. We're here because we want the best ideas. We're not sitting here saying we are the repository of all truth, but we want the truth. And if you're not seeking the truth, you'll never find it. Seek and find the truth. That should be the mandate for all of us to want to understand what our purpose in existing is.
That is life.
We have very limited time to do it, and this is the time to take action in talking to each other as fellow Americans. And I want to thank you, Ryan, and the other panelists for coming together to have such an important discussion and dialogue at a time where we need it more than ever.
The website is got-freedom.org. I want to thank you to the panel, Phil, Aubrey, Jenna, Dave, Gordon. Thank you for joining us. got-freedom.org. And it's the Amistad Project with the Thomas More Society. Thank you for tuning in, and God bless you.